Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Judaism and Recovery. We're reading the book God of Our Understanding, Jewish Spirituality and Recovery from Addiction by Rabbi Shais Taub, a chapter a week. This week we're on chapter 2. We had 3 chapters of introduction, so we're really into the meat of things. Last week we discussed what addiction is not, and we talked about the mental health model, the biological model, and the moral argument, and we all agreed that it wasn't answering all our questions about why addicts have a hard time recovering from addiction. So this chapter is going to help us understand. It works a little bit like Jeopardy. We're going to first find what the solution is, and by finding what the solution is, we'll figure out what the problem is. For example, if a person is cured by a pill of iron, then we're going to assume that his deficiency was an iron deficiency. If a person is cured by a blood transfusion, we're going to assume that he had a blood problem, etc., etc. So if we're not sure what the problem is, one of the ways to understand what the problem is will to find out what is the cure. Once we understand the cure, we will extrapolate what the problem was. Okay, so this is a little bit where this chapter is going to go, and there's no suspense here, there's no cliffhanger. The solution is the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. The solution is a spiritual solution. Therefore, it appears that the problem is a spiritual problem. All right, chapter 2. Now that we understand that for an addict, using is actually his or her best attempt at treating the real problem, we must ask, what is that real problem? Last week we said, using is not the problem, using is a solution to the problem. That's why the addict uses. In so many words, we have already said that the addict has a fundamental inability to live peacefully and contentedly, and uses his or her drug of choice to induce a temporary, here the key word is temporary, state of relief from his or her deep, incessant discomfort with life. And the drug of choice relieves that person temporarily, and therefore the person keeps on, has to do it again and again, because it's not a permanent solution, it is a temporary solution. And the solution needs to be stronger and stronger as we go along, and eventually it brings death. That's what we talked last week. But that still doesn't really answer the question. It still doesn't tell us what the problem really is. What is it that makes the addict unable to handle life in the first place? If we were speaking of a physical malady, say congestive heart failure, we wouldn't say that the person's problem is a pain in the chest. That's a symptom. The problem is that the coronary artery is clogged shut. So too, the fact that addicts are miserable when not using is a symptom of the problem. Addicts already know well and good how to treat the symptom. They use. The only way an addict can ever have a real choice to stop self-medicating the symptoms is if he or she can understand and treat the real problem that gives rise to the symptoms to begin with. In other words, we're not going to stop the chest pain. We have to stop and figure out the arteries that are clogged. And we don't know yet what the problem is. Last week we said it's not a goodwill problem, it's not a moral problem, it's not a biological problem, it's not a mental health issue. It is also, but it's not exclusively one. It cannot be cured exclusively by any of the ways that we cure other diseases. So the answer is the spiritual model. That's the answer. In order to understand, we're going to give a brief history of AA, how AA came to be, and because here in this room, most of you know some of the history, I'm not going to read word for word, I'm just going to give you the general overview. Roland Hazard, Roland H., he's mentioned page 27 of the big book, page 26 and page 27, a prominent American businessman that went to visit a doctor in Europe. The doctor was Carl Jung, and Carl Jung told him that his situation is totally untreatable, hopeless, that he has never seen an alcoholic of his type recover. And when Carl Jung was pushed that maybe there is a solution, Carl Jung said to Roland H., there is a solution, but because it occurs so rarely, it's considered an anomaly. And the solution is to have a vital spiritual experience. And the way, if we read the quote on the middle of page 14, to me, these occurrences are phenomena, said Carl Jung. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which are once the guiding force of the lives of these men, the alcoholics, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. In other words, I have to think differently, I have to feel differently, and I have to act differently. And the only way that this has known to occur in real addicts is through a vital spiritual experience. So Roland H. comes back to America. He joins the Oxford group that allows him to not only think differently and feel differently, but act differently. It was a religious group that put a lot of emphasis on acting differently, acting spiritual. Eventually, Abby Thatcher was also recovered through the help of Roland H. in the Oxford group, and eventually Abby, which was a childhood friend of Bill Wilson, came one day to the house on Clinton Street in Brooklyn, right down the street of Chabad World Headquarters, and he told him that there was no Chabad World Headquarters back then, 1934. They were still in Poland. Who's Polish here? That he told them that his solution to his alcoholism was a spiritual solution, and this is what he did. He schlepped Bill Wilson, Bill W., to the Oxford group. Eventually, Bill W. met Dr. Bob Smith in Akron, Ohio, and he shared with him, and then they together merged it to the program that's known today as Alcoholics Anonymous. If you see on the bottom of page 15, there's from a speech of Bill W. He described what Abby told him before the whole idea of Alcoholics Anonymous came by. Number 1, we admitted we were licked. Number 2, we got honest with ourselves. Number 3, we talked it over with another person. Number 4, we made amendments to those who had harmed. Number 5, we tried to carry this message to others with no thought of reward. And number 6, we prayed to whatever God we thought there was. If you look at the bottom of the page, I continue to read, these simple and elementary concepts were not religious, but spiritual. The difference was not lost on Bill. Okay? We're going to go to the second paragraph of the page 16. Through the collaboration of Wilson and Smith, not Will and Smith, these principles were developed into the program called Alcoholics Anonymous, the essence of which is summed up in the program's 12 steps. But that's not the whole program, by the way. The essence of Alcoholics Anonymous is in the 12 steps. But there's other stuff too. That's why there's a whole book called Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's 164 pages there. In the ensuing decades, these same steps will be applied to recovery from other addiction and work just as effectively. For the first time in history, there was a successful treatment for the disease of addiction. Like we said earlier in the introduction, until then people were just locked up and waited to die. A treatment that was neither physical nor psychological, not even religious, but spiritual. By living according to basic spiritual principles, addicts were not just able to remain abstinent, but also to lead happy and productive lives while doing so, which we did not talk about yet. Until now we're trying to see what's the good way to have a person stop using. Now we said that an addict is somebody who's miserable unless he's using. So now not only we found a way to stop them using, but we also found a way to stop being miserable. Now, Jeopardy style, if now we know the solution was a spiritual solution, we know that the problem was a spiritual problem. Now we are in better position to answer the question we asked earlier. What is the real problem the addict is attempting to treat by using? The real problem, as we can now understand, is a spiritual problem, as evidenced by the fact that the real solution is a spiritual solution. Okay, so now we know we have a spiritual problem. That still doesn't answer a question, because really we don't know what spiritual means. And even when we know what spiritual means, we're not really sure. We're pretty sure spiritual covers a wide range of issues that are related to the spirit. And what exactly, let's pinpoint exactly to what the problem here is. What does it mean to be spiritually sick? In other words, what is the root cause of the spiritual illness called addiction? Because there's other spiritual illnesses not called addiction. Let's continue with the story. Now I love this part of the story. That's the part that most people skip. In 1961, decades after Bill was first introduced to Young's spiritual approach to treating alcoholism, and AA has already bloomed into a massive movement all over the world, Bill wrote Young a long overdue letter of thanks. In the letter, he marvels at how Young had managed to ascertain that the only real treatment for alcoholism was a spiritual one, especially since it was such a radical stance at the time. So Bill W. says, thank you. Whatever you told Roland H. was very useful, but how did you know? In his response, Young begins by admitting that he had to overcome his own reluctance to offer such counsel, because it was indeed considered unconventional at the time. He then goes on to recall his impressions of his former patient Roland and of alcoholism in general. The patient's craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. We want to be whole, and we'll soon find out how we can truly be whole. But we yearn to be whole. Expressed in medieval language, the union with God. How could one formulate such an insight in a language that is not misunderstood in our days? Basically, he was trying to tell him, if I talk about God, they're going to think I mean religion. But I didn't mean religion. So I was very reluctant to use these words of union with God, in trying to explain a spiritual problem, a spiritual solution rather than a religion one. Because if I would say those words, I would be misunderstood. Now, I would like you to turn over to the next page. We'll come back. On the left side, on page 18, is a copy of the letter, the original letter of Dr. Young. And I would like to point out two things. First of all, besides quoting medieval sages, he also quotes King David in Psalm. Right on the bottom, where there's a little 1, and it says, as the hart panteth after the water brooks. That's a deer. Just as the deer yearns after a brook of water, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. So too my soul yearns after you, my Lord. Psalm 42. Just like a deer that cannot survive unless it finds water, and it wanders around in the woods until it finds the path to that water, and it's naturally attracted to the water, so too is soul. And David was talking about himself. My soul yearns to God in a way that is vital to its continued existence. I want to point out another thing in the letter. If you see the last paragraph in the letter where there's an underline by Carl Jung, you see alcohol in Latin is spiritus. and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as for the most depraving poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum. So we have a scientific way of explaining AA in 3 words. Spiritus contra spiritum. Spirituality to counter liquor. You should read the whole letter if you want, but at any rate, here is really 10, 20 years later, 30 years later, we find out that what Carl Jung had in mind was exactly what turned out to become Alcoholics Anonymous. Although he did not say in so many words, or he did not explain it, but it turned out that that's how it worked out, and it fit exactly what Carl Jung had in mind. These are heavy concepts. I'm going back to page 17. The spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, union with God. It's understandable how it might seem presumptuous to use such terms when describing a condition that most people see at no more than a chemical dependency, a mental disorder, or a lack of will. But history would bear testimony to the fact that Jung's understanding of the problem and solution, as later applied by Wilson, were astoundingly accurate. Almost miraculous, I would say. I mean, the chain of events is truly miraculous. So now we have our answer. The addict is sick with a yearning for God, just like King David said, just like a deer yearns for water, and can only become well by having some contact with God. Just like the deer needs to drink water to satisfy that yearning and that thirst. It sounds grandiose, I know. What are we saying? That all addicts are really super sensitive, spiritually passionate seekers? Not exactly. Addicts are not the only ones who yearn from God. Most aptly stated, all human beings have a deep-seated need for spiritual contact. So everyone needs a spiritual contact. Everyone has a deep-seated need. Deep-seated means it's internally hidden. But most people can also live their lives without it. As we can see. Most people survive without killing themselves physically, without being spiritually in tune, without having a conscious contact with God. Addicts are people who, for whatever reason, are unsettled to the core and cannot handle the business of life without maintaining a continual and acute awareness of the divine. Absent such high consciousness, they're miserable and sick. Now we know why you're miserable and sick. We're miserable and sick because we don't have God and we're missing that contact with God, just like some children are miserable and sick because they're missing some affection from their mother. Physical contact with their parent. And our soul is sick and miserable because we're missing this contact with God. What makes their dilemma fatal is that their drug of choice will actually produce in them short-term effect that simulate the release and relief that can only really be had through spiritual consciousness. It's like people seeking an intimate relationship in a house of,
The ball. The whorehouse.
In the whorehouse. That's a nice word in English for it.
Brothel.
A brothel. That's the word I was looking for. He's looking for intimate relationship.
I'm French.
Now, it simulates the intimate relationship just for a while. That's what it satisfies him. But he has to go again and again because it's not the real thing. Actually, the problem is that it feels the same thing. And that's what he's saying here. The drug of choice feels to the soul just like it would have a contact with God. That's our demise. Because if it would not work, I would stop taking it. I would look for something that works. Unfortunately, it works for a little bit. Consequently, the only treatment for the condition is to make sure that they can get the real thing instead of self-medicating with the fake stuff. For if they do not get the real thing, they have no choice, which is the addiction. Right there is the addiction. They have no choice but to take the fake stuff. If you were dying and you were in the desert and you had no water, would you drink your urine?
Yep.
Absolutely. It works too. It's the fake stuff, but it works. The urine is not going to kill you, by the way. But the drug will. But you have no choice. You have a choice to live or not to live. Living without this connection, without the contact, is miserable. In other words, for most people, spirituality is a luxury. Something to be sought after more basic needs are met. Addicts are somehow different in this respect, in that for them, there can be nothing resembling a normal life if their spiritual needs are not met first. I need my contact with God before my morning coffee. If not, I'm not going to make it through the day. Of course, now the same way that we said before, everyone has a deep-seated yearning for God, other people can also yearn for God. We don't have to be an addict to yearn for God. Of course, we don't mean to say that only addicts are capable of truly yearning for God. In the Song of Songs, King Solomon describes the feeling of being lovesick for God. That is not the point anyway. It is not the longing for spiritual wholeness that causes addiction. What makes an addict is the combination of two factors. One, they are profoundly disturbed and unsettled with their own existence. Yeah, they're not unsettled with other people's existence, although that's how they express it. But really unsettled with their own existence. As an entity apart from God. I can't be without God. I'm lovesick without God. But that anybody can be. You don't have to be an addict to do that. There are people who achieve a high spiritual level where they're sick without God. But, here's number two. For a reason unknown, they can somehow briefly simulate relief from this condition by taking the drug of choice. And that is the disaster. This is the trap of addiction. This is the real problem I've been trying to define. The real problem that lies at the core of addiction is that addicts are people who are in a dire need of a relationship with God, but are able to substitute fulfilling this need with a behavior that is essentially self-destructive. Really, the drug of choice becomes the addict's God. This is not mere rhetoric. Addiction is idol worship in the most fundamental sense of the term. Not bowing yourself to a stone, but idol worship means, what is it? Turning to something other than God to do for you what only God can do. That's the definition of idol worshiping. Turning to something outside of God for something that only God can do. And I fool myself to think that if I prostrate myself to the moon, I will get more water. I fool myself to thinking if I prostrate myself to the specific stone, blessing will come to me. Who do I want the blessings from? From God. Who can give me the blessings? God. Who gives me the energy? God. But idol worshiping is when I turn to something outside of God to get something that only God can give me. And if we define the addiction as the relief from the condition that I need a contact from God, therefore I'm idol worshiping every time I take a substance and swallow it in order to fulfill my need of my relationship with God. Okay. We're coming to the bottom line over here, which is on page 21. He's saying a little story about a speech that he gave, and he's quoting himself in the speech, and that's the part I want to read. That's the part that needs a lot of elaboration, and hopefully we'll have enough time to go through exactly what we need to go through over here. Yeah, we got some time. Okay. Let's start from the first paragraph on page 20. As I started talking, I found myself speaking about what Jung described as the spiritual thirst of being for wholeness, the union with God. The author was in a community where he gave the same speech to two groups. One group was non-addicts, and the second group he went to was the addicts. So now he's describing how he spoke to the addicts. Why do we yearn to be one with a God? I asked. What is it about us that makes us feel uncomfortable as an entity apart from God? This is very important. There's my entity connected to God, and there's my entity when I'm apart from God. So I can live my life as an independent entity or as a dependent entity. When I'm an addict, living as an independent entity hurts me, pains me. And the only way I feel better is when I live my life as a dependent entity with God. I proceeded to explain what Hasidus, the mystical teachings of the Hasidic masters, say about the very nature of separate consciousness being a painful delusion, an error in thinking that must be rejected in favor of the absolute truth that we do not really have as an existence that is independent from the all-encompassing, all-pervasive unity of all. So here we get to the crux of it. It's not about being comfortable. Uncomfortable is about being truthful or being fake. There is no such a thing as living separate from God. If there was in reality two options, one to live separately from God and one to live connected to God, then it would be a little bizarre that for some people living apart from God would be so painful. The reality is that there's only one option in this world. There's only one reality, which is that every single human being is a part of God, wantingly or unwantingly. The question is, how do I live my life? How do I perceive it? Do I tell myself a lie, an illusion that my life is independent from God? Or do I realize the truth that my life is truly dependent of God? How is it possible? Why is my life? Maybe I do exist on my own. Maybe I do. Who says that the reality is that I don't exist outside the existence of God? So the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, in the Tanya, in the second portion of the Tanya, Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, the gate of unity and faith, discusses very simply, puts in very simple words, why we cannot exist outside, why it's not possible to say so. He says like this: when I bake bread, I take water, the most simple French baguette, water and flour with a little yeast. No other ingredients in there. Okay? I take flour and I take water, and I together make a dough and shape it in the shape of a bread, or a long stick, and I put it in the oven at central temperature, and then when the bread comes out, it's now formed in a way that is different than the flour and water as they existed prior to my mixing it. And it's not reverting back. I don't have the power, nor anyone else in the room has the power, to take the bread and put it back in the form of water and flour. It's gone. What, in essence, did I do? Did I create a bread? No. I formed a bread. The bread had raw materials that existed prior to me coming into the room. I maybe had to purchase them, had to grind the wheat if I want, had to go to a well and take the water out, but I did not create water. I did not create flour. I shaped and formed the flour and water into a bread. That's what human beings can do. God is eternal. He's beyond time and space, which means that God existed prior to time and space. God was something before there was a world, and God will continue to be something even after there is no world. Therefore, when God created the world, He created something out of nothing. Or as they say in Latin, ex nihilo. Something out of nothing. And that type of creation is impossible for humans to recreate. None of us have the power to create something out of nothing. Out of thin air, we can't do anything. We can use the raw material in this world and create wonderful things. But at the end of the day, we're just shaping and forming and mixing pre-existing substances into new forms. phone, the iPad, everything. It's nothing new. It's stuff that's been around, that's been tinkered with in a way that now presents itself to us as a MacBook Pro. But did Steve Jobs create MacBook Pro from thin air? No. He used materials that were available in the world. So now we understand that our existence because it came from nothing, the nature of our existence is nothing. It means that being something is an unnatural state of being. For bread and water to create, for flour and water to create bread is natural. That's why it can't go back. It's natural for it to happen. For human beings, for creation, for this world to exist, is for us to be something is unnatural. For example, the Alter Rebbe gives an example from the Torah to explain this to us. It's not here in the book, but I have to add it just to give a little demonstration. The splitting of the Red Sea. It was a miracle. Nature of water is that it flows. Right? By nature, there's the gravity, the water does not stand like a wall. And God made a miracle, and the water separated and made a dry path, and the water stood like walls on each side of the Jewish people as they were crossing the Red Sea. What is needed? What is needed in order for the water to revert to its natural state? Nothing. It needed God to stop His miracle. It was natural for the water to flow. It's unnatural for the water to stand. Right? So, every single moment that the water stood as a wall was an unnatural moment. It was a miraculous, continuously miraculous moment that would revert back to water the second God moved away from the water. What does it take for God if God wants to destroy the world? If God wants to destroy all of the universe, and we're assuming here that God created the world, and that we believe in the God, and we believe in the crossing the Red Sea. If you don't, then it's a separate discussion that we could have afterwards. So right now we're assuming that, right? What does God have to do to destroy the world? Does He need a big ball of fire? Does He need a flood? What? Chassidus says He does nothing. As soon as God will do nothing, there will be no world, because the world is unnatural. The world is something out of nothing. At any given moment, it will revert back to its natural state of nothing. The same way the water would revert to its natural state of flowing freely and not standing like a wall. In other words, the natural state of all of the universe is not to exist. Our state of existence is unnatural. It's against our nature. Now, if you do yoga, you know that there is positions that we human beings are natural for us, the ones we always walk around, and the ones that we pretzel ourselves into when we pay that much money to be in a room to sweat with other people and stretch our bones. And that's an unnatural state of being. And then what happens? We become uncomfortable, and the yoga teacher says, connect with the uncomfortableness that you're feeling right now. Right? Don't let it go. Stay there for a moment. It's a metaphor for all the bothersome stuff in your life. Blah, blah, blah. Right? Hey, it's good. I'm not saying it's not good. But could you imagine if you had to live your whole life in one of those positions, twisted like a pretzel? It's unnatural. You would be uncomfortable. You would be miserable. Well, the Alter Rebbe, the Tanya says, being a human being is unnatural. By nature, your soul is miserable. But its own existence, because being something is unnatural. The nature is, the original state of us is nothing. What makes us something? God. God created us, and God is continuously holding our hand in order for us to stay something. And if God would let go for a second, we'll revert to be nothing. So if I accept that fact, if I'm resolved to the idea that God is the one who's giving me my power to exist, then I'm connected with the truth. And then it's natural for me to exist. But as soon as I deny that, and I say, no, I can exist without God holding my hand, I'm reverting to a state of unnatural existence, which then makes it uncomfortable and miserable to exist. That, my friends, in short, is what Chassidus says about why we become uncomfortable when we convince ourselves that we can exist without the existence of God. Anyway, I invite you to continue reading. Read these in the words of the author on page 20 and 21. I think I was able to summarize it in a way that makes sense, and if you have any questions, we'll continue at a different time.